The sound came first, not the wind, not the creaking pines, not the groan of the ice-hung rafters above her cabin, but a hollow sound, like something wooden giving way. It echoed up through the cold valley, faint but sharp, too deliberate to be falling snow or shifting frost. Martha Whaley froze with her hand on the door latch, the iron cold biting into her skin through her wool mitten, and she knew, without knowing how she knew, that it wasn't a tree, it wasn't a wolf, it wasn't something dead, it was a man, or something close to one. She stepped out before fear could form, wind dragging her long shawl sideways, boots cracking into a crust of frozen snow, as she made for the hill where the ridge bent like a crooked elbow just east of her woodpile. There wasn't any sound now, just the cold silence. And then she saw it. At first it looked like a broken fence post half buried in the drift. But as she crested the hill, it became a boot, a leg, the shape of a shoulder slumped, head hung forward, reins frozen stiff in gloved fingers that barely clutched a saddle already leaning. Horse halfway collapsed beside him. Snow had iced over their backs. The color was gone from everything. Coat, skin, even the mare's mane, all bleached bone white under hoar frost and sky. Martha didn't think. She moved, boots crunching through to the body, fingers fumbling through the stiff slick of ice along his collar. No breath, no sound, just the slick sound of frozen wool peeling back as she pressed her ear against his chest, which didn't rise, didn't fall, until it did. A rasp, faint as steam in wind, a lung trying to pull breath from a world made of knives. He was alive. She didn't call for help. There wasn't any help to call. Her nearest neighbor was 9 miles downslope, across 2 frozen creeks, and a gully that had swallowed a mule team the winter before. The only soul she had seen in over 5 days was a snowshoe hare that had darted under the porch and never come back out. So she gritted her teeth and pulled. The rider didn't weigh much. Nothing did after 2 nights exposed in a storm. But he was dead weight in every other sense. His limbs didn't bend right. His spine was hunched strange, as if frozen in a riding crouch. The mare gave one long, wheezing exhale and collapsed fully, snow puffing around her like dust. Martha took one glance, felt something twist in her gut, and left the saddle on her. It took 2 full trips. First the man, then the gear. She had to half drag, half roll him over the threshold, knocking a dent in the jam with his shoulder. She managed to get him onto the floor by the hearth before his head lolled sideways, and she saw the color of his lips. Blue, but not deep blue, not black, not death's blue. There was something under it still, something warm, trapped deep, like the glow left in coals that only looked dead. She stripped the coat first, caked in ice, leather too stiff to fold, and then unbuckled the vest, noticing for the first time that he had something heavy sewn into the lining, a bulge, flat and square. Metal? She reached for it but stopped. The man twitched. His eyes didn't open, not yet, but his mouth worked, jaw flexing like he was biting something. Then came words, slurred, almost groaned. Don't let it. That was all. Martha knelt beside him as the fire popped, slowly coaxing heat back into the room with new wood. She wrapped a quilt over his frame, tucking it tight around the limbs, and pressed her palm to his forehead, burning, but uneven, like the fire was only inside the skull. Fever. There was no time to wonder, no time to wait. Martha had buried too many already. Her husband, 2 sons, the doctor who had once ridden from town twice a month, and hadn't come up since last April. She knew a dying man when she saw one, and she knew how to stop it sometimes. She boiled snow, scalded rags, and cut a strip of rawhide to wedge in his mouth when the shaking came. It came hard. Legs kicked, his fists swung. At one point he sat bolt upright and screamed a word she didn't understand. Not English, not something she could repeat even if she tried. His eyes were open then, glowing strange in the firelight, but she couldn't tell if he saw her. By nightfall his skin was slick and his breathing turned shallow. She crushed herbs. She prayed, she burned lamp oil, and when the fit passed and he stilled again, she finally slumped beside the hearth, staring into the coals and wondering what she had just brought into her home. The next morning, he opened his eyes, not all at once, not clearly, but it was enough. He stared at the rafters, blinked slow, then turned his head. His gaze found hers. It was green, not sick green, not jaundice, but deep pine green like the treetops in summer. And yet the moment he looked at her, Martha felt the hair on her arms stand up, like she'd been caught doing something she wasn't supposed to. She said nothing. He didn't speak either. His mouth opened slightly. His throat moved. No sound, just a look. Long, measured, and something else beneath it. A kind of fear that didn't belong to a man who'd faced death alone on horseback. A fear of something worse. Martha brought him water. He drank it slow. When he tried to sit up, she pushed his chest flat. "You'll rip something inside," she said flatly. "You stay down Till I say so. His lips parted. He licked them. My name, he started, but Martha shook her head. No, not yet. You don't get to say a name till I know what kind of man I'm talking to. He blinked, said nothing, laid still. For 2 days he didn't speak again. He ate what she gave him, boiled potatoes, broth, bits of cornbread, but never too much. He watched everything. His eyes tracked her every move. She tried to ask him where he'd come from, what happened, who was after him, because something was, she could feel it in her bones. But he never gave a straight answer. On the 3rd day, a snow squall blew through. Martha was hauling wood when she heard a sound behind her. Not boots, not footsteps. She turned, and he was there, standing in the doorway in his bare feet, shirt half buttoned, steam rising off his skin. You're gonna lose your toes, she snapped. He didn't seem to hear. The mare, where is she? Martha paused. Dead, his jaw set. Did you bury her? I dragged her past the ridge. Wolves'll get her by tonight. He closed his eyes and nodded, almost like in prayer. When he opened them again, he looked different, harder, like something had snapped back into place. I need to go, he said. Now. Martha planted herself in front of him. You won't make it a mile. I don't need to. What does that mean? But he didn't answer. He pushed past her, and as he did, something fell from his coat, the square lump she'd felt in his lining. It hit the floor with a sharp clack. She bent to pick it up. It wasn't a flask. It wasn't a weapon. It was a case, black metal, hinged, about the size of a man's Bible, but heavier. There were symbols scratched into it, not letters, not any language she'd seen. He snatched it from her hands before she could open it. Don't touch that, he said, and for the first time there was iron in his voice. Martha stepped back. You bring something into my home. I got the right to know what it is. He met her gaze. I didn't ask to come here. No, she said. You just fell out the sky, didn't you? They stood there, frozen, as the storm howled outside. A crack of thunder echoed through the ridge. And then he whispered, They're coming. Martha felt her stomach drop. She'd heard no rumors, no wagon trains, no riders, no posse. Nothing had come up the pass in weeks, but the look on his face said he wasn't guessing. He knew. Who? She asked. His answer was slow. People who don't knock. And that's when the dogs started barking. The dogs didn't bark often. In winter they slept more than they moved, curling near the stone oven or under the crawl space where warmth leaked from the floorboards. But now both were up, howling in sharp bursts, hackles up, scraping at the door like they'd seen fire through the cracks. Martha crossed to the front window and lifted the curtain just enough to peer outside. Nothing but wind. The storm had thickened, a fresh flurry coming down sideways, erasing the ridgeline within minutes. But in that white haze, she saw something that didn't move with the wind. A shadow, too low for a man, too tall for a wolf. It stood still. Then another shape joined it, then a third. She counted 5 before she dropped the curtain. You brought someone, she said without turning. The rider said nothing. He stood by the hearth, arms crossed over the black metal case he'd picked off the floor, as if shielding it from her eyes would do anything now. His jaw worked side to side, chewing something internal, fighting with himself, and when he finally did speak, the words came slow. I didn't bring them, he said. They followed. Martha turned. Same difference. He exhaled through his nose, and in the glow of the firelight, she saw a fine tremor in his fingers. Not cold, not fever, but anticipation, the kind that lives in men who expect violence. Who are they? She asked again. He glanced toward the door, then back at her. They'll wait until dark. That's not an answer. They're not men, he said. Not all the way. She stared. The silence between them stretched long. Then she reached for the shotgun behind the door. It was old, older than her, a twin barrel side by side with a hairline crack near the stock, and one dented shell she didn't trust not to misfire. She hadn't loaded it since the last bear kill, and even then it was more noise than threat. But it was all she had. She turned back and found him watching her, not with fear, but with a kind of regret. You shoot one, he said. You'll only make the rest mad. I've buried 3 sons, she answered. Let me worry about that. The wind screamed outside. A gust slammed against the cabin, making the shutters rattle and the dogs yelp again. One bolted under the table. The other whined and scratched at the pantry door until Martha shouted it down. She turned to the man. What's in the case? He didn't answer. I swear, she said, stepping closer. If whatever's in there brings death to my door, You'll what? He interrupted. Send me back out in it? Turn me over to whatever they are? I might. He didn't move. You should. That caught her off guard. He looked tired now. Not weak, not sick, just tired. Tired like a man who'd run too far from something he knew would catch him anyway. He loosened his grip on the case, fingers twitching at the latches, and for a moment Martha thought he'd open it, but he didn't. They call it a cipher lock, he said, voice low. Once opened, it can't be closed again. Not fully. What's inside? A record, he said. A kind that proves something, or disproves it. Depends who you ask. Martha blinked. You mean a journal? He gave a hollow laugh. Not the kind that tells stories? She stepped back. Her hands were still on the shotgun. The fire popped again. He stared at the flames like they whispered some decision to him. I used to believe in truth, he said, but then I saw what truth does to people who aren't ready for it. Outside, something scraped against the outer wall. It was long, metal, not claws, not like wolves. Something slower, deliberate, almost as if tracing the outline of the planks beneath the snow-crusted logs. One of the dogs barked. Again, the other whimpered. Martha crossed to the window again, pulled the curtain tighter, and slid the bolt on the door. You said they'll wait until dark, she muttered. We've got what? 2 hours? Maybe less. Then we build, she said, and we trap. He looked up. My husband wasn't a soldier, but he was good with the land. We've got rock, snow, and timber. That's enough to funnel anything stupid enough to charge. You know how to dig post holes? He didn't answer. I'll take that as a yes. She threw him a pair of gloves. He caught them without comment, and then, without further words, they stepped out into the storm. The cold bit harder now. Visibility was gone past 50 feet, but that worked in their favor. Whoever or whatever was out there couldn't see them clearly either. Martha led him to the west slope where the snow deepened into a natural trench between 2 stands of pine. She pointed to the drop and said, We bottle them here. If they're not men, then they'll act like wolves. Wolves don't like to be funneled. He didn't argue. They worked without speaking. She hauled branches and split logs from her winter stash. He took a shovel and began carving narrow paths through the waist-high drifts. They jammed sharpened stakes into the frozen ground, using heated iron rods to punch holes when the frost was too hard to pierce. The trap they built was simple. A kill alley, 2 narrow walls of spiked snow leading into the cabin's side path, forcing anyone approaching into single file. By the time they finished, his lips were cracked and bleeding. Her fingers were numb to the knuckle, but neither said a word about stopping. Only when the last stake was in place did she speak. They're not gonna just walk into it. They might, he said, if they think you're worth the blood. She gave him a look. What makes you think I'm worth anything to them? You're alive, he said. They trudged back to the cabin in silence. Snow was building against the porch now, half filling the step. Inside, the dogs cowered under the table, ears twitching. The rider closed the door behind them and finally sat down. He reached for the case again, opened it with slow hands, and turned it toward the firelight. Inside was a stack of vellum sheets, not paper, thicker, stiff, and something else, not drawn in ink but etched, burned almost, as if the words had been seared into the surface with a tool finer than any pen. Martha squinted. The text wasn't English, wasn't German, wasn't Latin, but it was letters, just not any she knew. What is that? He held it up. A map. Of what? People, he said. She stared. What does that even mean? He looked at her, and in his voice was something she couldn't name, not pride, not hope, but something that had once belonged to both. It's the names of everyone who vanished last winter, every settler gone, missing between here and Carson's Ridge, every family buried and never exhumed, every soul who disappeared without a trace. Martha's throat tightened. That's 50 miles of wilderness. 52, he said, and the valley's just the start. She stared at him, blinking. You tracked them? No, someone else did. I stole it. From who? His eyes dropped. The ones outside. Martha stood still for a long time. Then, why? He took a long breath. Because they weren't supposed to be keeping records. Not of us, not of anyone. The fire crackled. They were studying, he said. Watching, counting, waiting. For what? He looked up. For what happens when no one comes looking anymore? And then the wind outside went still, just for a second, just long enough for the silence to return like a blade unsheathed. That was when the first knock came. It wasn't a fist. It wasn't even hard. Just a soft, deliberate tap, tap, tap on the front door, like a neighbor might do, like someone polite. Martha felt her heart seize. The dogs went dead quiet. The rider stood. The tapping came again. Then a voice, soft, genderless, smooth like stream water, but colder than the ice on the rafters. We don't want the woman, it said through the door. Only the record. Martha looked at the rider. He didn't move. We can leave, the voice continued. No pain, no mess. You hand it over. No one dies. The rider stepped forward. No one else dies, the voice added. The air inside the cabin seemed to change. Denser, heavier. Martha could barely breathe. I have a better offer, the rider said. He walked toward the door, holding the case in one hand, and in the other, something she hadn't seen before, a shard of what looked like dark metal pulled from inside his coat. He looked back at her. Keep the fire going. Then he opened the door. The cold punched through the doorway like a living thing. Not just wind, but something older, weightier, something that carried silence like a weapon. Martha saw it before she felt it. The snow didn't swirl when the wind moved through. It parted, like something invisible stepped across the threshold of the woods with a weight that even snow respected. The rider stood in the doorway, the case in one hand, the dark shard in the other. His coat was open. The firelight flickered behind him, throwing long shadows that licked the log walls. Martha didn't speak. She didn't breathe. She just stared through the crack of the door at the things outside. They weren't men. At first glance, they could have passed for hunters. Tall figures in heavy coats, hoods drawn, scarves pulled tight across their faces, but their outlines didn't shift with the wind. They didn't flinch when snow hit their shoulders. Their posture was too still, too perfect. There were four now, standing in a semicircle just beyond the fence. One stood farther back, behind them, taller, broader, motionless. "We don't want you," the front one said again. The voice was the same, soft, non-threatening. It didn't match the shape of the shadow it came from. "We want what you carry." The rider stepped off the porch. Martha couldn't stop herself. "Don't." He raised a hand to silence her. "It's all right." And then he walked out into the snow. The dogs whimpered. Martha stood frozen, the shotgun still clutched at her side. She moved to the door and opened it a crack wider. She could hear the snow under his boots, could see his breath curl in the air. The four figures didn't move. "I'll give it to you," he said. The front figure inclined its head, the motion too smooth, like joints weren't what moved its neck. "But I want something first," he said. A pause. The voice came again. "You are in no position to bargain." "I'm in the only position," the rider said, holding up the shard of metal. "You left this behind at Fallon Creek. You know what happens if it touches fire." That made one of them shift, a flinch, barely perceptible, but it was the first human thing Martha had seen from any of them. "You'd destroy the cipher?" "I'd end it," the rider said, "and you'd lose the only complete ledger left of what you've done." The front figure tilted its head. The wind carried no sound for a moment. Then, "You won't." The rider took one step closer. "Try me." It wasn't bravado. Martha could hear it in his voice. He wasn't bluffing. Whatever that shard was, it had weight, not just physical. The figures knew it, and for the first time they hesitated. The one in front turned slightly, as if looking to the taller figure behind. Then it nodded. "What do you want?" The rider didn't answer right away. He turned his head toward the cabin. His eyes found Martha's. In that single look, something passed between them. Regret, decision, farewell. He turned back. "I want safe passage for her," he said, "and a promise that your kind never sets foot on this ridge again." The figure laughed, not loudly, not naturally. It was a mimicry of a laugh, like someone trying to remember what one sounded like. "You bargain like you still matter," it said. "I matter enough to burn this whole thing down." Another silence. Then the voice changed, slightly lower, slightly more human. "You'd give your life for a woman who doesn't even know your name." He didn't flinch. "You took her son 2 years ago. North Trail. 10 miles east of Weeping Rock." Martha felt her heart stop. The figure said nothing. "She buried an empty coffin." Still nothing. "She deserves this." Then he held up the shard again. A long pause. Then finally the front figure stepped back. "Leave the case. Walk into the woods. The woman will not be harmed." The rider looked once more at Martha. She took a step out. "Don't do this," he smiled. It wasn't warm. It wasn't sad. It was just tired. "You saved my life," he said. "Now I'm giving it back." And with that, he set the case down in the snow. The figures didn't move. He turned, walked down the ridge, past the line of trees, into the dark. The moment his figure disappeared behind the snow-covered pines, the figures moved as one, not with human motion, but with an eerie precision, silent, gliding. They scooped up the case, turned, and followed. Martha stood dumbfounded. It took several seconds for her feet to respond. She dropped the shotgun and ran down the slope, stumbling through drifts, eyes scanning the tree line for any trace of him. But he was gone. Nothing but footprints, and even those were vanishing. That night the ridge was silent. No wolves, no wind. The cold itself seemed to ease, like some great tension had passed. Martha sat by the fire until the logs burned down to coals. The dogs curled beside her, twitching in their sleep. She didn't sleep. She couldn't. The man had left his coat. In one pocket she found a folded square of parchment, handwritten in English. She read it twice before the lamp oil ran out. "If they return, go to the stone at the hollow tree east of the pass. Dig beneath it. Burn what you find if they breach the cabin. Bury it if they don't. Your son's name was in the ledger. So was mine." She stared at the words until they blurred. Days passed. Snow fell again, deep and slow. No travelers came. No signs of life across the ridge. Only silence and the long, quiet days of a widow too used to ghosts. She didn't leave the cabin until the thaw began. When she finally did, boots creaking through the crust, frost glittering on the pines, she went to the tree he'd named. It took half the morning to find it. A dead trunk with a hollow hollow wide enough to fit a man's arm. Beneath it, buried under rock and earth, she found a steel tube, capped at both ends. Inside, a letter, several in fact, names, locations, timelines, and something else. A map, not of the valley, not of towns, but of routes, movements, paths of people, traders, settlers, lone travelers who'd disappeared in patterns too perfect to be accidents. Martha read until her hands went numb. She saw her son's name, and beside it, a code. Apt 1147, subtype X, behavior, cooperative. She saw dozens more, and then she saw the last page. Not a letter, not a map, but a note, scribbled in hurried handwriting, messier than the rest. If you're reading this, then I didn't make it back. That's all right. I wasn't supposed to. Keep this safe, or destroy it. Just don't let them erase it. They only win when no one remembers. Below it, no name, no signature, just a symbol, a crude carving of a flame inside a circle. Martha stared at it for a long time. Then she reburied the tube, packed the earth tight, marked it with a stone, and walked back home. That spring, the floods came early, the rivers swelled, roads vanished under mud, mail stopped reaching the higher ridges, but still Martha waited. Each morning she walked the edge of the tree line, listening. One day she found tracks, a single pair, fresh in the mud, heading west, too long to be hers, too narrow to be any rancher's, but they didn't lead to her door. She never saw him again. But that wasn't the end, because months later, when the thaw was full, when the pass reopened, men came, not the kind with badges, not the kind with cattle or carts. Men in black coats, tight-lipped, quiet. They asked questions. She answered none. And when they left, she watched their horses vanish over the ridge with a rifle on her lap, and both dogs growling low. Years passed. The story spread. Some said a ghost had visited the widow's ridge, a rider who died and rose again. Others said she'd lost her mind, buried herself in grief, imagined it all. But the strangest thing, the part no one could explain, was this. The disappearances stopped. No more vanished travelers, no more empty cabins, no more lost sons. And though Martha Whaley never spoke of it again, not to the preacher, not to the storekeep, not even to her last living niece who came up the ridge 10 years later, she kept one thing on her mantle till the day she died, a black shard of metal scorched on one side. She never explained it, never let anyone touch it, and when she passed, the item vanished. Some say it burned with the house in the lightning storm that took it all. Others say it walked off into the woods, carried by a man with a green gaze and no name. The years didn't erase it. They softened it, blurred it, thinned it out like wool unraveling in water. But the story clung to the high valleys like hoarfrost on pine. Travelers didn't speak of it loudly, but those who passed through the Whaley Ridge, what few still dared, carried pieces of it in whispers, and as the old roads closed and new ones circled wide around the hills where no one farmed anymore, the legend of the silent rider spread farther than his footsteps ever had. No one rebuilt Martha Whaley's cabin after the fire. Nobody rode up to salvage lumber or pull iron nails from charred beams. The slope was too steep, the land too hard, and by then, the floodline had washed the only passable trail into a gorge. All that remained was a broken stone chimney and a twisted door hinge lodged in the soil like a bent finger pointing west. But people still went missing, just not there. In the counties south of the old ridge, on stagecoach lines that had once seen steady travel, entire convoys vanished in fog without a trace. 5 families headed for Silverton disappeared between way stations. A telegraph operator in Langley reported hearing a voice on the line speaking in code no operator could decipher. Then he went silent for good. In a mountain town called New La Rue, the sheriff's deputy uncovered a leather-bound ledger buried beneath the floor of a boarding house, written in a language no one spoke. He hanged himself a week later. The tremors hadn't ended. They'd just shifted, and someone knew. Because in the 3rd winter after the fire, a new name started passing quietly through trading posts and river towns, not spoken at first, just etched in chalk on barn walls, carved into beams, scratched into church pews. She remembers. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a warning. It was a signal. And when the floods returned for a second time, washing out nearly every known trail leading to the valley, someone made it through anyway. Not a lawman, not a rider, a girl, barely 12, thin, dirt-smeared, hair hacked short like a boy's, eyes ringed in ash. She limped into a trapper's shack 5 miles east of the old Whaley Ridge, shivering so hard she dropped her only bundle, a burlap satchel tied shut with baling twine. Inside was the shard, black, warm to the touch, etched with a single line of crude script burned into the metal. For her, she'll know what to do. The trapper was old, too old to climb the ridge. But he told the girl where to go, gave her a coat 3 sizes too big, a single hard biscuit, and pointed to the line of trees that hadn't seen foot traffic in a decade. She nodded once and left without a word. No one saw her again. But a month later, a priest from the northern parish swore he saw a woman standing in the ruins of the Whaley cabin at sunrise, alone, bareheaded in the snow, wind blowing her shawl like a flag. He claimed she looked no older than 40. Martha Whaley would have been 76. When they searched the ridge again in the thaw, they found no footprints, no signs of fire, no bones, just the same scorched chimney and the same wind-polished stone she'd used to mark the place where she buried what the rider had left. But now the stone had been moved, and in its place a fresh carving, a circle, a flame. Time has a way of sanding things down. Memory dulls, faces blur, and people lie, but places don't. And if you ride far enough west and climb the switchbacks past Mended Rock and the Wishing Falls, there's still a path, overgrown, mossed through, but it's there. Locals call it Widow's Trace. They won't take you up. But sometimes, in late autumn, when the fog lifts and the last leaves fall clean from the birch, the wind carries voices down from the ridge. Not screams, not howls, just whispers, names, over and over, not yelled, not spoken, but breathed, like the woods themselves remember. One such name, carved into the base of a pine 3 feet from where the cabin stood, was her son's, Joseph. No one alive carved it, and no one ever erased it. Some say the rider was a ghost, a man already dead by the time Martha found him. Others say he was something worse, not dead, not alive, but caught in some borderland space between both, burdened with something no man should carry, the memory of the lost. But there's a third story, never told in daylight, shared only around the fires of those who've seen the others. The tall ones, the watchers, the ones who don't knock. They say the rider was one of them, once, until he learned what they were doing, until he turned against his own kind, until he fell in love. Not the romantic kind, not even the kind with names or touches, but the love a soul feels when it sees another suffer the same wound, when a man stares into the void and sees his own mother's eyes staring back. They say that's why he stopped running, why he gave her the shard, why he walked into the snow without looking back. He didn't come to escape them. He came to warn her, and to leave the truth in hands strong enough to carry it. The government sealed off that stretch of the valley in 1893, citing mineral dangers. They marked the land uninhabitable. No roads led in, none led out. But someone still keeps the trail clear. Because just 3 winters ago, a pair of hunters from Caraway took shelter in the ruins during a sudden freeze. They built a fire in the chimney and found under the soot 3 perfect handprints pressed into the stone, smaller than a man's, bigger than a child's, still warm. The next day they turned back. When asked why, they didn't answer, but they never hunted again. One of them began carving wooden circles into every fence post he passed. The other went mute. Neither one ever set foot near the ridge again. Back east, the name Martha Whaley doesn't appear in any official record after 1878. Her cabin's land grant was never renewed. No relatives came forward to claim the lot. And when one prospector tried to buy the land in 1912, the paperwork vanished from the state archive before he could sign. The clerk who filed it suffered a stroke the following day and died without regaining speech. Since then, the land has remained untouched, and every attempt to survey it has ended in silence. Not rejection, not denial, just silence. Like the paperwork is swallowed, like something doesn't want it to be seen again. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the truth didn't disappear with the rider. Maybe it didn't burn with the cabin. Maybe it's still out there, in the eyes of every widow who keeps her fire burning through the freeze, every mother who lights a lamp for a son who didn't come home, every girl who walks a ridge alone and feels watched, but not harmed. The story didn't end. It just went underground, because some truths don't need to be shouted. They just need to survive. And what survives becomes legend. And what becomes legend grows teeth, especially out here in the wild, where the snow never fully melts, and some doors, once knocked on, never shut again. The old man who spoke to the surveyor said the ridge never truly belonged to the Whaleys, or to any settler for that matter. He leaned over his cane, voice soft from years of frostbitten lungs, and muttered, "That land took people long before her. It only started giving 'em back when she stood her ground." He didn't say what that meant, but the story, like the land, never rested. A century passed, then another. Rail lines came and went. Electric lights reached as far as Carson's Bluff and New LaRue. Maps were redrawn. Industries rose. Counties folded into districts. And still, the ridge remained a blank space on official ledgers. A strange omission in an age that prided itself on precision. No topographic elevation markers. No wildlife survey, no real estate claims. The forest returned, swallowing the trails, shifting the stones, erasing the old chimney until only moss-covered rubble hinted that a cabin ever stood. But someone kept finding their way back. A boy once, 17, small for his age, ran away from a lumber camp after being struck across the jaw by his uncle. He survived 9 days in the woods, snow up to his waist, nothing but a hatchet and a borrowed coat. When they found him, his clothes were nearly shredded, but he carried a strange calm, like someone who'd crossed a line most men never reach. When asked how he made it, he only said, "She fed me." Another time, a mail courier lost in a blizzard took shelter beneath an uprooted pine near the base of the ridge. He swore a fire lit itself 20 feet off, crackling in open air with no wood and no fuel, just warmth, real and thick and orange. It vanished by morning. He never delivered that letter. The truth is, no one leaves that place unchanged. They come out slower, softer, or not at all. There's a story told by the oldest trappers in the southern ranges, men too old to hike now, who pass winters in single-room shacks with crooked chimneys and shelves full of preserved roots. They speak of the hollow folk, figures who wear the shape of men but don't blink, don't breathe, and don't bleed. They travel in pairs, sometimes 3, never alone. They don't knock, they don't ask, they only watch. And when they vanish, something disappears with them. A child, a horse, an entire homestead. No trace, no noise, just absence, so deep it stains the ground for years. But in their tales, there's always a counterweight, a figure on foot, not armed, not fast, but always just ahead of them. A shadow they chase but never catch. He leads them off course, buys time for the rest, leaves behind tokens, a circle burned into a tree trunk, a small flame drawn in ash, a scrap of blackened parchment half buried in the snow. The trappers don't say his name. They just call him the memory. Not a memory, the part of the land that doesn't forget what was taken. They say he walks because someone once gave up everything to hold the door shut behind him. And they say that door is still up there, buried beneath the soil, somewhere near the hollow pine and the old stone marker no one can find twice in the same season. A door that leads nowhere, but once opened, can't be closed again. In 1962, a geologist named Dr. Leonard Carmichael published an obscure paper in the Rocky Soil Review titled Anomalous Magnetic Readings in Unmapped Territory between Carson's Bluff and Upper Langley. The article barely caused a ripple in academic circles. It cited erratic compass behavior, inexplicable thermal readings, and subharmonic seismic pulses inconsistent with any known fault line. At the end of the paper, in an appendix few ever read, he mentioned a non-verifiable local legend about a woman who once held off a group of entities by refusing to surrender a black cipher case. Carmichael speculated the story might be an allegorical preservation of indigenous oral tradition, then dismissed it. He was found dead in his home 6 months later, papers scattered, attic burned through from the inside out. His research vanished from the university archive. When asked about it decades later, one archivist replied, "What paper?" The whispers never stopped. A railroad worker in 81 went missing for 3 days after a tunnel collapse. When they dug him out, he was clean. No dust, no soot, no panic. Said a woman in a grey shawl had shown him how to breathe through the rock. He died of a stroke 2 years later. At his funeral, the only thing in his coat pocket was a tiny shard of metal, charred on one side, etched with a single symbol, a flame in a circle. Maybe the story is different every time. Maybe the rider didn't die that night. Maybe he left the case not as a trade, but as a trap, a beacon to mark who would come next. Or maybe he was one of them, changed, half unmade, struggling to hold on to the last of what he was, and she gave him something back by simply choosing to save him instead of fearing him. There's a kind of power in compassion that terrifies things which live only to consume. Some say that's what the others feed on. Not flesh, not blood, but forgetting. To be forgotten is to be erased. And when no one remembers you, your loss becomes a hole nothing can fill. But Martha Whaley remembered. She remembered every name. That's why they couldn't touch her. She'd lost more than they could ever take. It's said the fire never fully goes out up there. That if you climb the ridge during the longest night, when the moon is low and the wind is still, you can see a faint light through the trees, not flickering, glowing. And if you follow it, you might hear voices, not crying, not pleading, just saying names over and over. Joseph, Anne, Miles, Iris, Emmett, names no longer in any book, names no longer on gravestones, names that were taken, recorded, erased, but not forgotten. And if you kneel beside that light, some say you'll find a small ring of stones, and inside it warm ash, no flame, no smoke, just a pulse of heat like breath. And sometimes, sitting beside it, a woman. Not old, not young, wrapped in a faded shawl that moves even when the wind does not. She won't speak, but if you ask the right question, not about yourself, not about her, but about someone lost, she might look up, and in that gaze, you'll feel every weight you ever carried melt from your bones like snow in spring. Then, without warning, she'll vanish, the light will dim, and you'll find yourself alone. But your pack will be lighter, your feet warmer, and the way forward clearer than it's ever been. This is how the story ends. Not with a grave, not with a name in a book, but with a trail that only appears when you've lost everything. A path cut through the dark, marked by nothing but a single circle burned into bark and a flame that cannot be extinguished, because it lives in the hands of the forgotten, the grieving, the defiant. It lives in every mother who stares down winter with nothing but will. It lives in every man who dies to give someone else one more sunrise. It lives in every fire that stays lit, even after the house is gone. The rider never came back, but he didn't have to, because she stayed, and the valley never forgot what she did. Not once, not ever.